Welcome to Art 101. My name is John, and I'd like to start with a broad introduction into the content of the course. In doing so, I'll discuss a few of the course learning outcomes and show you how we're going to address those and others throughout this semester. So let's start here with Jackson Pollock and Dave Hickey. I like to start with Pollock's drip paintings, where he laid a large canvas on the wall and flicked and dripped paint off a brush onto the surface, as you see it here. And I like to start with him because it really is one of those questions that I imagine my grandfather, for instance, as a young man, going into a museum in 1950 and seeing this on the wall and going, why is this here? Why do people think this is great art? And that's the kind of idea, the issue that we're going to address in this class. And let's think about it in terms of what Dave Hickey says about art in our time, in the 20th century and beyond. Dave says art is a referendum on beauty and a contest of values. That's how he sees art functioning in the world up until today, really. He's a contemporary art critic and scholar today. So think about that museum then. For some reason in 1950, those of us got together and said that they considered this beautiful for some reason, right? 100 years previous, my grandfather would have gone into the museum expecting to see something like this. And of course, at that time, the function of art was a little bit different, and it was an image like this that idealized this gorgeous Western landscape that was considered to be a valuable and beautiful expression. Now, think about it in terms of contemporary times as well. It's a practice, the landscape, that photographers and painters continue to this day. By 1983, we see Richard Misrach in very much the same area in the Western landscape, making images like this. And by 1983 standards, these images were in art galleries and museums, and Misrach became a very famous and very important artist of our time. But we can see it's a very different kind of expression of the world around them, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of our course. How about that contest of values part? We see how an idea of beauty changes throughout really just the last 150 or so years of art history, right? What does Hickey mean by a contest of values? He says today, right, art is not only meant to be beautiful, but it's meant for us to have this contest, to debate what we consider important. And here we find by 2015, Richard Misrach is still making desert landscapes in the American West, but now he's down at the border, and he turns out to take a series of landscape photos that contain parts of the border wall with Mexico, right? And of course, very few years after this happens, this sort of ignites into a political contest of values, one that was very much seen. And so Hickey argues that that's one of art's modern functions, is to really sort of create an arena in which we can have these debates. And I think Misrach's desert wall photos are a very good example of that. That brings us to kind of one of our first course objectives. What we're trying to learn in this class is to appreciate the influence of visual art on the quality of life. Let's think about that term, the quality of life. What do we actually mean by that, right? What's important to our quality of life? It's interesting that it's a concept that was first in Western culture, really termed or coined by the Greeks. They had a word for it, and their word was the term eudaimonia. And eudaimonia today is casually translated into happiness, but the idea was really much deeper than that. The ancient Greeks saw the world around them. They saw the animals in the world around them, for instance, and they recognized that animals seemed to try to survive, right? They hunted for food, and they reproduced, and they tried to not get killed and things like that, right? And the Greeks saw themselves as separate from that natural world. They saw that they had another level of existence. Sure, they did all those things, right? But they seemed to, be more curious and thoughtful about their worlds. And it's satisfying those things that they saw as eudaimonia, that very thing that was the finest thing about humanity, about what the Greeks would later call humanism. They recognize it, and they recognize that humans sort of not only seek comfort and pleasure from the world around them, but they actually seek to reproduce it as well. They seek to create it. And Aristotle, in the openings of his Metaphysics, explains it in just this way. He says, all men desire to know. An example of this is the delight we take in our senses, for even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for their own sake, and none more than the sense of sight. Right? So he's saying, of course, that we seek pleasure in viewing, and we create objects to satisfy these impulses. And of course, the Greeks even had a term for that, and that term is mimesis. Again, the modern sort of quick explanation for that is imitation, right? We look to imitate things. Think about any time you use your cell phone camera to take a picture of your friends or places you've been, right? You're creating an imitation, a reproduction of that experience, of that place, of that image, right? But it was more than just a copying in that way. What they really thought mimesis to be was the term that kind of defined this impulse to create, but for a specific purpose, I should say, in order that their correspondence to the physical world is understood as a model for beauty, truth, and the good. So even back in the ancient Greeks, they're sort of reflecting what Dave Hickey says today, right? That it's the place where we define these things for ourselves. What is beauty, truth, good in that way? Of course, they made sculptures like this. And here we see, at least in the human form, right, an idea of an ideal beauty. Right, this is Venus. It was a later Roman version, but it's the same kind of idea where the statue itself is supposed to put us in mind of thinking of these eudaimonia kind of oriented aspects of life. Which brings us to our next course objective. We're going to demonstrate a familiarity with major historical and contemporary movements in art and be able to understand how art reflects its time. And that's something I'll sort of demonstrate here. In fact, let's use that concept of beauty, and very specifically that concept of the female form and feminine beauty. One of the earliest examples, and for a long time, the earliest known example of a human figurine sculpture was the Woman of Willendorf, which was discovered in 1908. It was made more than 27,000 years ago. And at the time it was discovered, we didn't even think that Paleolithic man of that period was capable of mimesis, of this kind of copying, and potentially even of eudaimonia, as the Greeks later call it, right? And it brings up another interesting question that we'll talk about throughout the course, right? Well, why did they make them, right? What is the function of art practice in this particular society? By the time we get to ancient Greece, and Praxiteles is sculpting Aphrodite, the goddess of love, for her temple at Knidos. And we can see now the modern expression of the ideal human form, the ideal feminine beauty begin to develop. And again, it's something that really we see practiced to some extent and reflected to some extent in our own lives today. It may well be that Paleolithic man was making their sculptures for the very same reasons. Of course, as I said, that kind of marches through history that way. By the time John Singer Sargent is painting commissioned portraits of the well-to-do throughout Europe and the United States, you can see in his work both the quality and the beauty of the imagery and the brush strokes and the richness of the color, as well as the figures themselves, that he seems to be sort of following this particular idea about beauty and feminine beauty in this form. 60, 70 years later, we have William de Kooning making Woman number 3. Did several of these from 1950 to 1953, and it seems to reflect a much more primitive way to make an image. In fact, it's more similar possibly to the Woman of Willendorf than it is to Aphrodite or Singer Sargent's paintings, right? Well, why does art change, right? And why, in the historical sort of expression of this particular idea about beauty, right? Why does it seem to reverse itself in 1950? These are the kind of questions that we're going to ask and discuss in these classes so we can better understand why this generation and this art world may have indeed regarded this as a great valuable work of art, as a referendum on beauty and as a successful contest of values. And then that did happen. in this case. And one little bit of evidence I can give you to that is that this painting was sold in 2006 for $137.5 million. And so clearly it is something that has gained appreciation and value, at least to somebody, through history. And it is certainly a contemporary way that we evaluate those things now. So what about today? Do we still follow this trajectory of expressing and imitating for beauty, truth, and the good? What example could I show you from our own culture from today? How about this one? Now, it may seem somewhat trite even, but if you really think about it, right, isn't our popular culture of the day, doesn't our popular culture of the day, our music videos, our films, comic books, things like that, don't they in some sense reflect these very same historical practices? Couldn't you discuss Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B in the same way as representations of what we value as a culture, in the same way that we discuss Aphrodite of Aeneas as an expression, as a settled upon expression of that culture? And that's what this class is really going to be about. We're going to learn about these historical art practices. We're going to tie them to our own practices. We're going to create sort of our own referendums on beauty and our own contests of values. So ultimately, I hope we'll learn why art really matters. And I look forward to a great class, and I hope you guys enjoy it as well.